Welcome to Policy on Demand. I'm Scott McCandless. As promised during his presidential campaign, President Trump announced the imposition of a 25% tariff on imports coming from Canada and Mexico, and an additional 10% tariff on imports coming from China. Joining me to discuss how these tariffs could affect U.S. companies is Chris Desmond. Chris, welcome.
Good to be here.
Great to have you. So could you set the table for us a little bit? Right out of the gate, Inauguration Day, a lot has happened, a lot of executive orders. What happened with regard to trade?
Well, it's kind of funny, Scott, because we were preparing for this for a while. And movie references, you like movie references.
Sure.
So 40 years ago almost,
Mm-hmm.
Ben Stein was teaching an economics class in the movie Ferris Bueller's Day Off.
Right.
And he was talking about the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930.
Amazing.
Class was asleep.
Mm-hmm.
Class is not asleep.
Great point.
However, we were a little disappointed on what happened on Inauguration Day
Mm-hmm.
because we were feeling as if we were going to have these tariffs overnight that you mentioned, because that's what was said.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't happen. However, we did get the America First trade policy, which was kind of like a movie trailer
Sure.
of what may be happening this next year around trade.
Mm-hmm.
Renegotiation of USMCA, free trade agreements, let's look at them all. But the one that was really important, at least from us from a trade perspective, was the deficit one. It's under 2A, talking about investigation of unfair, unbalanced trade deficits.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where I think is going to be a key piece, because the tariffs that we might have, the retaliatory, or not the retaliatory, but the actual tariffs
Sure.
of the 20% tariffs across the board,
Mm-hmm.
they might be surgical,
Mm-hmm.
and it might be related to this.
Gotcha. Makes a lot of sense. So these tariffs seem like they could be coming online as soon as February,
Yeah.
ones that he's announced. Could you talk a little bit about the magnitude, given that we're dealing with some of our largest trading partners?
So some of our biggest importers we have in the United States, Canada, Mexico. If we did an analysis over the holiday break and we looked at the impact over a year of the actual supply chain and layering on what would that tariff impact look like. So when we're looking at Canada could be up to $107 billion of tariffs, hitting industries of oil, natural gas, motor vehicles, and parts.
Mm-hmm.
Mexico is going to be a bigger one. Mexico could be about $132 billion. And the auto industry is going to be probably biggest hit. But we also have digital processing units, insulated wires. We also have, if you think about it, a vehicle can go across the border up to 8 times.
Okay.
And the question is, does it get tariffed every time? We don't know.
Okay.
So a lot of auto companies are looking at that saying, well, where do we start calculating the tariff? It's not just that one time coming over the border, but we have vehicles going back and forth all the time. And we also have tariffs coming in from Mexico from their imports.
Mm-hmm.
So these are going to be some big hits, and companies are really trying to sharpen their pencil and figure out how to calculate that.
Makes sense. So trade is a two-way street, like you said. Sometimes the path to completing a vehicle goes across the border 8 times, and trade comes and goes. What about retaliatory tariffs? Might these other countries that the United States might be tariffing, might they also respond in kind with some tariffs of their own? When might we see that, and in what kind of magnitude might we see those?
Well, I think it's going to be after the U.S. announces their tariffs.
Sure.
So we have this investigation that's going on,
Mm-hmm.
and we have the investigation that's going to be happening, but there's also, as part of the foreshadowing, is we might have some executive orders and executive actions, ones that actually involve investigation, some that do not, can be overnight, depending upon what the investigation does tell us. Other countries have said already on record, including Canada, Mexico, we're going to have retaliatory tariffs. We also have heard European countries do that. So if you think about a lot of the U.S. manufacturers, think of bourbon. I don't know if you're a bourbon guy. I like my bourbon,
Sure.
but bourbon is going to be highly tariffed going outside the U.S. probably, because that is one of our big exports we have that is U.S. manufactured. There's lots of other products, but I kind of honed in on that one. And we're probably going to see retaliatory tariffs. And then from a multinational perspective, how do you then calculate your operating model from a supply chain ops, from a tax, from a customs and trade perspective? Because it's not only the U.S. footprint, but you might have to look at what's going on in Mexico and Canada and Europe to your overall profitability.
Mm-hmm.
And that's going to be a challenge, because these tariffs, Scott, is one of the biggest challenges when we start doing the numbers for a company. When the tariff amount gets so big, it's almost like, do we have any profit left?
Sure.
And that's a question that some companies are asking themselves if the worst case scenario plays out.
You and your team do a phenomenal job in consulting with companies on all these issues. Could you talk a little bit about some mitigation strategies, or what some companies you're talking with are thinking about in terms of possible changes to their global supply chains?
That is number one question I am asked from the C-suite, and it's usually I do a lot with the customs and trade folks, but the C-suite now is asking these questions because these are holistically huge costs that can play. So calculate's number one. Three things. Calculate. You got to make sure you're able to do good calculations of your footprint, of your operating model, of your countries, your country of origin, and down to the product level if you can, because there's going to be, when we do have tariffs, it's going to come out to the HTS classification. So it's going to be specific to products, but also to countries. After you're able to calculate it, can you mitigate it? And mitigation, when you think about it, you can take some big swings at this, and it could be through exclusions. It could be through duty deferral, through an FTZ, or even a refund on your duties through things such as duty drawback. But after that, you're left with what's remaining. And that's where you're going to have to do some other things. And that's where you're going to bring in your tax team and look at what does that tax operating model look like, combined with your supply chain ops team and your customs team. Because as you're able to chip away at this, you're just trying to mitigate some portion of the potential impact.
You had mentioned the word exclusions.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about what that is, or what that has been in the past? Define it for us, and whether you think that process might be available again this time.
So when we saw the tariffs come out in 2018, 2019, and companies filed for exclusions from economic hardship, or if it is strategic importance, those exclusions were granted. And a lot of them were also granted when it came during the COVID time. So a lot of products that are coming in that were important for, battling against COVID, those then became part of the exclusion list. Well, a lot of that stuff has expired. And that process usually happens after a list is announced, is that you have a period to submit your exclusions. And if you are approved, then you actually get paid back what you've already paid from the tariffs. And then going forward, you no longer have to pay those tariffs coming in the border. Now, will that happen this next time? For me, I don't necessarily think we're going to see a lot of exclusion opportunities, because part of what these tariffs are is part of a bigger agenda, a bigger agenda of a number to obtain related to revenue coming in. It's not to give relief, but it's also to obtain this amount that might be used for other things, including, tax reform coming up and other measures. So I'm sure there will be some exclusions, hopefully like toys, or some, I think some of the industries that are hardest hit are, pharmaceutical products. But after that, I don't see the same process being as expansive as it was last time.
Makes sense. So maybe a final word of advice to our viewers, who I think have their eyes and their eyebrows, very high on their foreheads right now, saying, "Oh my gosh, this is really coming." What other advice might you have for companies, whether it's dealing with people in Washington, talking to people about the potential exclusion process, or just looking internally at some of the operational changes they might be able to make?
What I hear is a lot of companies are having a tough time with lobbying and policy, because it's like who you're going to talk to. So what you can focus on is your company and what you can control and your supply chain. And what I think would be really important to do, as I mentioned, is being able to effectively calculate what your numbers look like, where those dependencies are, so that when we do hear of a tariff being announced for Mexico or Canada by a percentage, you can quickly see who your dependencies are by supplier, by product, but also the retaliatory tariffs that you mentioned. So what does that look like? Can I quantify that? Where are they going to? Is it related party or not? Is there transfer pricing opportunity there to help mitigate this? But having the data real time is going to be key. Otherwise, it's going to be a rush, and you might be too late for some of the mitigation opportunities.
Terrific advice and insights as always. Chris, thank you very much for being with us, and we expect to have you back a lot during this very busy year ahead.
Thank you, Scott.
Thank you, Chris. And for our viewers, linked in the description of this episode is PwC's 2025 Tax Policy Outlook, which includes a section on trade and tariffs. And stay tuned for more as developments unfold on tariffs and other issues at the start of the new Trump administration. Thank you for joining us, and take care.